Hey guys, today we're going to install the Havoc 6.5 inch lift on this Chevy Silverado 1500. Now before you get started, you're going to need to know that there's going to be some cutting, grinding, and a little bit of welding on this truck. So make sure you read through the instructions, kind of get comfortable with it, and make sure you have all the tools necessary to complete it. We're going to go ahead and get started.
All right, so we got the vehicle jacked up, we took the wheels off, got the front and back supported. We're on a lift, you don't necessarily need that. But the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and disconnect the ABS line up front. There's a few connectors here. First in the back, we're going to pull this clip off here. It's going to pop out of the way. There you go. Okay, so first you slide the red tab up. And just press on that. Black piece there. This comes right apart. Comes out. This, we're going to use a 10mm wrench. Go ahead and pull this out. This bracket comes completely off. And then we'll disconnect the gray holder. Some little lineman pliers. Okay, so we want to go ahead and we're going to remove this bracket here holding the actual brake line with a 10mm as well. And we'll disconnect the actual piece here. All right, so we're going to squeeze. We're just disconnecting the ABS line bracket from the holder. Just squeeze in there. That pops right out there. And then we'll just separate this. And it comes right off. All right, now we're going to use a 21mm and remove the nut that holds the tie rod in place to the knuckle. We're just going to tap the actual knuckle itself while lifting up on it to break it loose. It's just tapered, so it should break loose with a few hits. And then I like to put my nut back on these here so that we don't lose it. And now we're going to use a 19mm and take the two bolts that hold the caliper to the knuckle off. Now we're going to hang the caliper out of the way, making sure not to pull on the brake line, and put it in a place that doesn't impede the further progress of the lift. All right, now we're going to use a 15mm and we're just going to remove the nut on the top here of the sway bar end link. Use a 15 top and bottom. We're going to want to do that on both sides so that we can roll the sway bar out of the way, get the end links off, and then we're going to actually remove the sway bar mounts. All right, now we're going to take the splash guard off. There's 4 10mm bolts and 2 15mm bolts. All right, so we're going to be removing the sway bar mounts. We're going to want to mark passenger and driver side before we take it off so that we know we get it back in the correct orientation. Just use a 10mm and break these 4 loose. All right, so the next step would be to remove the dust cap around here, but for some reason this truck doesn't have one. It's a couple of years old, so maybe at some point somebody damaged it and discarded it doing some service. We're gonna use a 36mm axle nut. To back this axle nut out, we've got a couple of lug nuts here to protect the threads, and I'm using a breaker bar to keep it from spinning while we use an impact to take that off. We'll pull the nut and washer off and set those aside for use later. All right, now we'll use a T30 to remove this bolt right here, and then we can slide the rotor right off.
So before we take any bolts off the strut, we need to make sure that we mark our passenger side strut and our driver side strut so that when we go to reinstall this stuff, we get it back the way it came out. So now we're going to go underneath the strut here and we're going to take out these two 15mm bolts. Make sure when you're doing this that you have a jack supporting the lower control arm, because that's under pressure. Okay, so same thing here. Before we take out the 6 bolts holding the CV in, we want to mark that up here with a passenger and driver side, just so that when we go to reinstall it, it gets back in the same way. And these 6 bolts here are 15mm. So what we're going to do next is we're going to remove the lower and upper nuts holding on the knuckle. And when we do that, we're going to thread it back on a couple threads so that we can strike the knuckle and loosen up all the tension that's up here. So when you're striking the knuckle, you want to make sure that you don't hit any, like the lower control arm or the upper control arm. You don't want to hit anything but the steel knuckle. All right, so once you break that knuckle loose, then you can just unthread that bolt the rest of the way. As you can see, when we broke the top loose, the bottom came loose a little bit too. So this should just take a few strikes to get it off. So next what we're going to do is remove the CV shaft. You can actually pull on the control arm a little bit to lower it down. And you want to make sure you push from the front and make sure that these little rubber boots do not rub or get marred up in any way when you're pulling this out. Just like that. Now with the CV shaft out, you can just pull the whole hub assembly out. Just unthread that nut at the bottom. And now that it's broke loose, it should just fall right out. The next thing we're going to do is take these 3 nuts off the top of the strut assembly. So on the last one, the whole strut assembly is going to want to move, so you just kind of have to hold on to it so that it doesn't move around too much while you're trying to take this nut off. And then once you have that nut, just push down on the lower control arm and the strut should just come right out. Next, we're going to remove the lower control arm. That's going to be an 18mm on this side and a 24mm on the other side. So once you do that, control arm will just fall and you can just pull it right out. So the next thing we're going to do is remove these 2 crossmember struts, and that's just 2 15mm bolts on each side. So next we're going to remove the rear cross member, and that is going to be 4 bolts, these 2 on this side, these 2 on this side, and they are 18mm. Alright, so before you remove the drive shaft, you're going to want to make a mark to show the orientation between the drive shaft and the differential input flange. And then you're going to go ahead and remove these 4 bolts from the drive shaft. And then you're just going to hang the drive shaft out of the way. So now we're going to remove the differential actuator plug here. You just pop that little red tab out, just like that. So there's also 3 clips that's holding this wire harness to the differential. We're going to want to remove those. I'm going to show you this one right here, but this is probably the only one that you're going to be able to see. And then just like that with the other 2.
All right, so here we are on the driver's side rear lower control arm mounting pocket, and we're going to actually have to trim and remove this 3.5-inch section of this frame pocket. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure 3.5 inches from the end here all the way up, over and around, and onto the other side. Then we're going to cut and remove this entire section here. And then we'll use the flapper wheel to clean up where we've cut and removed this section here. And we're going to want to make sure it's nice and clean, wiped down and everything, because we're going to be welding a plate on here.
So now that we've made this cut in the rear cross member pocket here, we can now remove the differential. To do that, it's two 21mm bolts on the passenger side and two 18mm bolts on the driver's side. You're going to want to make sure the differential is supported by a jack, and I highly recommend using another person to get this out, because you're going to have to shift it around a little bit, and it is very heavy.
All right, so now that we've dropped the diff down just a little bit, we've got a couple of retaining clips for the wire, and we've got the drain tube here that we're going to disconnect. Go ahead and drop her down. Just make sure you guide this thing down as it comes out. Okay, we've got the front differential here. There's the mounting ear here. We're actually going to be taking this portion off so that it'll clear the electronic steering. You're going to make two vertical cuts with a reciprocating saw. You're going to be cutting straight down this way, perpendicular to this mounting surface itself. And then we're going to be cutting in this way, just behind this plate here. Now we'll just use the flapper wheel to go ahead and clean this up and contour, make it look nice, and take the sharp edges off. So on the other mounting ear, on the same differential, we're going to be taking 3/8 of an inch off. So from the center hole here, we want to measure out and mark 1 inch straight across, and then we're just going to shear that piece off.
All right, so we got our differential here on the table. We got our differential bracket. What you're going to do is you're going to take 4 bolts out, this one, this one, this one, and this one. And then you're going to use the provided hardware with your bracket in place, and make sure you use your red Loctite that comes with your hardware. All right, so we're just going to thread these bolts in, kind of snug them up with the impact, and then we're going to torque them down to 33 foot-pounds.
Now we're back to the lower control arm pocket that we trimmed. We're going to place this reinforcement plate on it, and then we're going to tack weld this on here with the chamfered corner up here towards the front. We're going to be welding this back edge here from the outside on the vertical and on the outside on the vertical, front and rear, and then on the top horizontal portion we're going to be welding from the inside. We've tacked this in place. Now we're going to go ahead and weld our final seams. Okay, now here we are on the passenger side. We're going to be trimming off these wings here from the rear mount for the lower control arm. You're going to want to be about 3/8 of an inch from this inside face, the actual surface of this wing here on both sides. So we're going to do this first while our weld cools from the other side, and then we'll jump over and finish up on the driver's side. All right, I'm over here on the driver's side now. I think this weld has cooled enough for me to get in here and do some cutting. So again, we're going to want to be about 3/8 of an inch from this back face to the front edge of this actual wing here from the mount for the lower control arm. So we'll just go ahead and saw that off. All right, now we'll just clean this up with a flapper wheel, and then we'll add a coat of paint to anywhere that we have exposed metal underneath here to prevent corrosion.
All right, so now we got our differential drop bracket. This is the driver's side drop bracket. You can distinguish this one from the passenger side because it's got this little notch on the top, and in the bottom it's got provisions for 2 bolts, where the passenger side only has provisions for 1. And you're going to use the factory hardware to go right back into the mount. And we'll just thread that in by hand right now. Okay, so you're going to want to torque these down to 65 foot-pounds. So now we're on the passenger side with the passenger side differential drop bracket. It's just going to fit right over these bolts. And then you're going to put the factory nuts back on. Be sure to use thread lock. And you're going to tighten these down with a 21 millimeter.
All right, now we're going to put the front differential back into place. Make sure you use a transmission jack to hoist it into place, or a jack if you have it on the ground. Then we're going to use the provided hardware and start down here at the passenger side. We'll get 1 bolt started. All right, now we're going to use the provided hardware to mount the driver's side bracket in place.
All right, we're going to reconnect the differential actuator wiring. So just make sure you run that along the differential and reconnect into the little mounting locations.
All right, now we're going to cut the wire loom tape that holds the breather tube in place, because we're going to need to pull a little bit of slack out of the breather tube, and it's going to have to be removed from this wire loom. So just be really careful when you do it. You don't cut any wiring.
All right, so now you can see where we made our alignment marks on the drive shaft and on the differential input. So we're going to just line those up, and then we're going to reinstall the drive shaft.
We're going to get these bolts started, and then we're going to torque them down to 19 foot-pounds.
You're going to want to make sure that you apply thread lock to each bolt.
All right, now we're going to put the rear cross member in place. We're going to be using the factory bolts, and we're going to be putting those in from the front towards the rear.
You're just going to want to leave that loose right now until we get everything put back together, and then we'll go back and tighten it up.
Now we're going to put the rear front differential mounting bolt in place. We're just going to move the differential around until it fits through. We're using the provided washer, nut, and bolt. All right, now we're going to put the front cross member in place. We're going to be threading the bolts again from front to rear using the factory mount bolts, and then using that factory washer and nut again. All right, now we're going to use the provided bolt, nut, and washer to put the front differential mount in place. We're just going to lift that in place till we can line the hole up. That's right in. So we're going to tighten the 5/8 inch hardware to 120 foot-pounds torque, and then we're going to go through and tighten the 9/16 hardware to 90 foot-pounds, and then we're going to go through and tighten the 1/2-inch hardware, which will be down at this end, mounting the diff to the actual drop bracket to 65 foot-pounds. So we're not actually tightening the hardware that came with the factory and attaches these cross members yet, just the bolts that attach the front diff to the actual mounting brackets. Right now we're going to be putting the front skid plate in place. We're going to use the factory bolts up top.
And there it
Let's
is
get
right
that
there.
lined up. Make sure to use some Loctite on these bolts so it doesn't come loose. Get those in. We're going to leave all this hardware loose right now. We're just getting it started, but we want to be able to shift everything around still, so we'll just get it hand tight. All right, now we're going to put the differential skid plate on top of the front skid plate here. We'll just get these bolts started.
So we also have this cross member brace that we're going to be using the provided hardware. Go into the rear cross member.
And again, we're just going to thread lock this as well.
And then through the front. All right, so we're going to go ahead and snug down all this hardware, and then after we install the control arms, we're going to tighten these down to 65 foot-pounds.
All right, now we're going to be putting in the lower control arms. We're going to be feeding the bolts from front to back on both the front and back mounts. And you're going to use the long one in the rear. Use the provided washer, nut, bolt. Again, we're using some blue thread lock here to ensure that these don't ever come loose. And we're going to leave these loose for right now. All right, now we'll tighten the bolts that hold the drop bracket cross members to the original mount locations. We're just going to snug them up, then we'll come back and torque them down. All right, now that we've got these snug down, we're going to tighten these to 125 foot-pounds. Now we're going to set the torque on the skid plate bolts to 65 foot-pounds.
So next, we're going to attach our strut spacer to our strut using the provided hardware. Now this is only going to fit on one way, just like that. You're going to use a washer and a nut on each of these studs. When we're tightening this down, we're going to have to use the vise just so nothing moves on us, and we can get it nice and tight. So now that we have our spacer in, we can go ahead and install the new strut. And again, it's only going to install one way, and you're going to use the factory nuts on the top. And again, you're going to want to use Loctite on all those studs. So now that we have the top of the strut loosely installed, we're going to lift up the lower control arm and install the bottom part of the strut with the factory bolts. And then we're going to go ahead and torque all this hardware down to 40 foot-pounds.
All right, now we're going to take the factory knuckle and remove the unit bearing assembly from it using a 15 millimeter. 3 bolts. Now that just comes apart. Discard this old knuckle. Then we're going to take off this dust shield here, make some marks, and we're going to trim it off. All right, so we're going to measure a 1/2 inch out from this corner. We're going to make a mark here, and then we're going to come down to this corner, and we're going to connect this corner to that with a straight line and trim and remove that portion. Now we're just going to use a flapper wheel to clean up the edges here and make sure that it's nice and clean. All right, now with the dust shield trimmed, we're going to reinstall it onto the unit bearing, and then we're going to install the unit bearing onto the new knuckle using the factory hardware. We'll run them back in lightly with the impact and set them to 133 foot-pounds of torque. Now we're going to install the aftermarket knuckle into place on the lower control arm. I'm going to use the factory nut and just put a few threads on there so that it holds it in place. All right, now I'm going to use a pry bar to bring the upper control arm down so that it feeds into the top of the knuckle there. Being very careful because it's under load. Then we use the factory nut. Get a few threads started on that. Now we've got that preloaded. All right, so according to the instructions, if you have a lower control arm that's steel, you shouldn't need one of these spacers, but what we found is, as you can see, there's a good portion of the actual ball joint sticking out below this piece here, so we're going to use this spacer. We did on the other side when we did it, and add the factory nut back on. Otherwise, I don't think your lower ball joint's going to be tight.
So now we're going to reinstall the CV shaft. To do that, you're going to have to maneuver it around a little bit and kind of bend some of these joints. Just be careful that you don't mess up any of these boots when you're maneuvering it in and out. Alright, so once the CV shaft is in there, you want to put the washer and axle nut back on. We're going to tighten that down to 155 foot-pounds.
Now we're going to torque our lower ball joint nut to 74 foot-pounds, and we'll tighten the upper ball joint nut to 37.
So next we're going to install the CV shaft spacer with these 6 provided cap screws.
Now we're going to tighten these flange bolts to 45 foot-pounds. Again, we're going to come out here to the hub and hold that with a breaker bar so that we can put the proper amount of torque.
Now when you're tightening these, you're going to want to make sure you go in that crossing pattern, same as you would do a tire.
All right, now we're going to take the tie rod end off. So I suggest taking and actually putting it into the knuckle. That just kind of holds it still so you can get this jam nut loosened. So 22 here and a 24 here.
like so.
Once that's loose, pull the nut off, and this will just spin right off. All right, so now we're going to trim the tie rod end. We're going to measure out 5/8 of an inch from the actual very end here out and mark that, and we're going to cut this portion off here. Now you're going to want to make sure the inside of the threads are clean from any burrs or any metal shavings or anything like that before we try to put this back on. All right, now here's the tie rod end. We've used some tape to protect the threads and also to make where we can have a mark that we can see. You're going to want to measure 1/2 inch from the very end of here to your mark and then take that off. Leave the jam nut in place when you do this, so when we're done, we're going to actually run that off and clean the threads up. Once this cools a little bit, we'll make sure that we use a file and clean up the edges, and then we'll run that nut off of it to do the final thread cleaning. All right, now we'll put the jam nut back on and screw the tie rod end back on, being very careful not to let any of these threads that we modified get hung up. Seems to be going on nice and smooth. We're going to run that all the way down, see how much room we have. It calls to leave an 1/8 inch of threads showing behind the jam nut. Once you've got the tie rod end screwed on as far as you can go to the tie rod, again, we're just going to drop this in place here to hold it while we tighten this jam nut.
So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to have to relocate this brake line. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove the retaining clip here, and then we're actually going to take a Sawzall and we're going to cut just the innermost portion of this bracket so we can actually remove the brake line from the bracket, and then we're going to remove the bracket. Make sure you retain this clip because you're going to reuse this.
Now we're going to take this hard brake line and bend it and form it so that we can put it into this replacement bracket, and then we'll reuse the clip that we had before. Next, we're going to use a crescent wrench and some channel locks to peel this off of the rubber brake line here. I would highly recommend doing this before you put the caliper back on because it's easier to get in there and get some leverage on it. All right, now we're going to reinstall the rotor, taking note of where the set screw is located. I'm going to use a T30 to fasten that down. Now we'll reinstall the brake caliper. Now we're going to run the ABS line. We're going to run behind the knuckle through the inside of the upper control arm, and then we're going to place a strap on that in the factory upper control arm using the factory bolt with the aftermarket strap. All right, to get the ABS line to reach, we're gonna have to cut this gray strap here that's attached to the body up here. Once you free that, you should have plenty of slack to be able to reach your connector.
All right, so we're going to take one of the provided clips and clip the ABS wire to the back of the knuckle here using one of the self-tapping bolt and washer that they give you in the kit.
All right, now we're going to reinstall the sway bar. Remember our passenger and driver side marks we made before we took it off for orientation. We have some drop brackets right here, some replacement bolts. They're cap screws. Make sure you thread lock those. We're going to put a washer on the heads of those, slide them through the original mount hole and then through the extension. We're going to do that on both driver and passenger side, and then we'll hoist this thing into place and put these screws to 45 foot-pounds of torque. Once we've got these started, we'll use an electric impact just to spin the threads on, and then we'll do our final torque with a torque wrench. Now we're going to attach the sway bar to the lower control arm with a tie rod end link. It's got a bushing and a washer up top here. We're going to slide it from the top, and then we're going to put another bushing and a washer on the bottom side of that. Then we're going to feed through a new sleeve that it's got here. And then we've got another washer and bushing on the bottom before we go through the control arm. And then we'll have another washer and bushing on the bottom side. All right, now we'll torque down the sway bar bolts to 45.
So now we're going to tighten down the sway bar links here, and you're just going to compress those right until the bushing starts to form a little bit. You can see those bushings start to compress a little bit, and that's when we're done.
Now we're going to attach the tie rod end link here to the knuckle. Let's drop that in. 21 millimeter factory nut goes on the bottom. And we're just going to torque that down to 44 foot-pounds. All right, to get this started, we're going to take a 10 millimeter, spin it in reverse, and hold the 21 in place, and that'll get it tightened up. All right, now that we got that set, we'll put our torque wrench on it.
All right, so the first thing that we're going to do in the rear is remove this brake line bracket right here, and that's going to be a 10 millimeter.
Now we're going to remove the ABS line from the retaining clip in the top and bottom side of the frame. All right, you can't really see up on the top side of the frame, but I just used these, use some pliers and a screwdriver just to pop this up out of the pocket in the top of the frame. Now we're going to use a 13 millimeter to remove the bracket that holds the parking brake in place. All right, now with the rear end supported, we're just going to go ahead and remove the lower shock mount bolts. Now we're going to remove the top shock mount bolt and drop the shock out of place. All right, now we're going to use the 21 millimeter to loosen and remove the U-bolts from one side only. We're going to do one side at a time. You can discard these U-bolts, but you're going to want to hang on to this coupling piece.
So we got the U-bolts off on the driver's side, and we got our axle supported by a hydraulic jack, and I'm just going to lower that down so that we can get this little spacer block out.
All right, now we're going to lower the axle down just enough to get this lift block in place. If you look at it on the top, there's an F for forward. Make sure that you put that forward when you're putting it in because it helps to roll the axle a little bit. So we'll just drop this axle down, making sure nothing's getting hung up when you do. Right there. All right, now we'll just lift it back into place, making sure those pins line up in their spot. Lines up nicely. keep going. I think you're good there. Now we'll just put the replacement U-bolts on, making sure we clear all the wires and get into the receiver cups on top. And then we'll just put our coupling piece here on the bottom. And we have to pinch it a little bit. And then a washer and a nut on each U-bolt. All right, now we're going to use a 22 millimeter to snug these U-bolts into place. We'll do our final tightening on the ground. Now we're going to take the bump stops off, use a 10 millimeter socket, and get up in there and access that bolt through the hole in it. All right, now we're going to add these bump stop extensions. Take your cap head screw that they provide, feed it through the bump stop, then through the extension, and use an 8 millimeter Allen socket to get it started here by hand. And then we're going to torque this down to 35 foot-pounds once we have everything seated. All right, now we're going to put the shocks back in. Before you do that, you're going to want to take some grease on the outside of these bushings, press them into place, and then put the bushing sleeves in on both top and bottom of both shocks. And we're just going to use the factory bolt. We added a little bit of thread lock for good luck. Let's put that in. And now we're going to put the lower shock bolt in place. Just going to want to press it up and then catch it when it comes back through. All right, so I'm just going to run this on with the impact because it's a locking nut. Make sure you don't crush anything or push on anything, then we're going to torque these down to 65. All right, now we're going to add a bracket to extend the mounting point for this hard line where it connects to the rubber line. First, we're going to go ahead and add the bracket on, put the factory bolt back in place, and then we're going to bend and form these hard lines so that they'll meet up to this and we can put a bolt and nut to capture those two together. I'm just going to tighten this into place. Now I'm going to bend this bracket here, being extra careful with these hard brake lines. Make sure you don't kink them or put any extra stress on them. Use the provided bolt and then a washer on both sides and then a locking nut on the back. And now use a 13 millimeter front and back to snug that up. Now we're going to put the ABS line back into the retainer here on the bottom side of the frame. We won't be able to get it in on the top. And then if you see any loose or troubling looking spots where the wires might hit, just use some zip ties and fasteners to keep that stuff nice and neat and out of harm's way. Okay, so we removed the parking brake cable on the driver's side from the hanger bracket. Now we're using 13 millimeter bolt to reinstall it with the factory fastener.
Okay, now that we've got the wheels and tires on, we're going to go ahead and bounce the suspension a couple times. We did that already. We got in when we hit the brakes, just to get everything settled. And now we're going to go back and tighten the U-bolts in the rear to 120 foot-pounds. So now we're going to torque down our lower control arm bolts. There's 2 on each side. These are going to get torqued down to 150 foot-pounds. And then after this, we're going to want to check to make sure that our tires aren't rubbing in any locations in the front or in the rear. And then you're going to want to take this immediately to an alignment shop. All right guys, we just got the truck back from the alignment shop. Now there was a little bit of trimming that we had to do to provide some tire clearance, but that concludes the installation. If you have any questions, give us a call or visit us online.